Be doing Miami. So first I'll talk a little bit about their head coach, and then I'll talk some about the roster, and then I'll go through their schedule game by game and give you a predicted winner and loser for each game. So head coach Mario Cristobal enters his third season as the head coach of Miami. He's uh, entering his 13th season as a head coach. He's been a college head coach at two other places, Oregon and Florida International. Oregon was the place that he was coaching at right before Miami. And he's one of the best recruiters in the country. His first full recruiting class at Miami in 2023 was the seventh ranked recruiting class. And his recruiting class in 2024 was the fourth ranked recruiting class. But the problem is his game time coaching has been horrible, and it's cost his team games just because of how bad of a game time coach he is. And his record at Miami so far is a losing record at 12 and 13, and that's unacceptable with the talent that they've had. And his overall record as a head coach is just barely above 500 at 74 and 73. And he did work for Nick Saban at Alabama for 4 years from 2013 to 2016 as their offensive line coach. So I actually think that he's going to have a good season finally at Miami, and he's got to, or I think he's going to get fired. Uh, so Miami also had the number 10 ranked group of transfers this year, and they have 66% of their production coming back, which is a decent amount. So starting with the offensive side of the roster, they've made an upgrade, I think, at quarterback, bringing in Cam Ward from Washington State, a great pocket passer. He had last season 3,735 yards and completed 66.6% of his passes, and he had 25 touchdown passes and averaged 7.7 yards a throw. He averaged over 300 passing yards a game last season, and he looked really good in the spring game, completing 19 of 24 passes for 324 and three touchdowns. I think Miami's got one of the best quarterbacks in the ACC this year. And then at wide receiver, I really like their starters at wide receiver. I think this is one of the best starting units of wide receivers in the country. Uh, so they do lose one good receiver who transferred out, Colby Young, but they return their top wide receiver, Xavier Restrepo, who had last season 85 catches for 1,092 yards and six touchdowns, averaging 12.8 a catch. And he had 5 games of over 100 receiving yards last season. And they return Jacoby George, who is also a very good wide receiver, who had 57 catches for 864 and eight touchdowns, averaging 15.2 a catch last season with 2 games of over 100 yards receiving. And they bring in a really good wide receiver from Houston, Samuel Brown, who had last season 62 catches for 815 and three touchdowns, averaging 13.1 a catch, and had 3 games of over 100 receiving yards. But Miami does need to get more out of their tight ends with pass catching. They only completed 21 passes to tight ends last season. And at running back, they're really good here too. They bring in one of the best running backs in the country from Oregon State, Damian Martinez, who had last season in 12 games 1,185 yards, which is nearly 100 yards a game. And he had that on 194 carries, and he had 9 touchdowns and averaged 6.1 yards a carry. And he had 6 games of over 100 rushing yards. And they also have Mark Fletcher coming back, who uh, was a four-star running back who had in 9 games as a freshman last season, 514 on 105 carries and 5 touchdowns, averaging 4.9 a carry, and had 2 games of over 100 rushing yards. I would expect him to get more carries this season. And then the offensive line, I think, is going to be good this year. They've got 3 starters coming back. They've got both starting tackles back. They've got Jalen Rivers, who only allowed 14 total pressures and 2 sacks last season. And then they've got Francis Magoa, who is a 5-star offensive lineman who started every game as a freshman last season. And he did allow 23 pressures and 5 sacks, but I would expect that to be improved this year. And then they return right guard Hez Cooper, who only allowed 9 total pressures and 1 sack last season. And then they bring in a great center from Indiana, Zach Carpenter, who only allowed 3 sacks and 8 pressures total last season and has started 25 games in college. Now, the left guard spot is questionable, but overall, this offensive line is going to be pretty good. And Miami's offense, I think, is going to be one of the best in the ACC for sure, and maybe one of the best offenses in the country this season. Uh, so now moving on to the defensive side, I really like their front seven. This should be one of the best front sevens in the country this year. Starting on the defensive line, they return Ruben Bain, who's a really good player, who had 44 tackles and 7.5 sacks and 3 forced fumbles and a pass breakup and 45 total pressures last season. He's going to play in the NFL, no doubt. And then they bring in 5 transfers on the defensive line. I'll mention who I think the top 3 are of those. They bring in one from Michigan State, Simon Barrow, who has in 2 years combined at 76 tackles and 7.5 sacks and 50 total pressures and a forced fumble and fumble recovery. I'm sure he'll be a starter. And then they bring in from Marshall Elijah Alston, who had last season 45 tackles, 6 sacks, 37 total pressures, and 2 forced fumbles, and 2 pass breakups, and uh, a pick six. And they bring in from Tennessee Tyler Barron, who had last season 28 tackles and 6 sacks and 41 total pressures and a fumble recovery and 2 pass breakups in 12 games. So I think those will be the starters on the defensive line. But those other 2 transfers that they brought in, I'm sure will play a lot too. Uh, and then I like their linebackers. They bring back Francisco Magoa, who had last season 82 tackles and 7.5 sacks and 3 pass breakups and 27 total pressures and 2 forced fumbles and an interception. One of the best linebackers in the ACC. And then they have Wesley Bazaneth, who had last season 44 tackles and 2 sacks and a fumble recovery. He was a 4-star recruit. And they bring in a transfer from Louisville, Jalen Alderman, who had last season 62 tackles and 1.5 sacks and 2 pass breakups. And their cornerbacks look to be pretty good. They return Daryl Porter, who played and started in 10 games last season and had 23 tackles and 4 pass breakups. He's a 5th-year senior. And they bring in a cornerback from Washington, Michelle Powell, who had last season 38 tackles and 6 pass breakups and 3 interceptions, one for a touchdown. But the safety position is a concern, not with talent, but they don't have hardly any experience there. And this coach at Miami has not proven that he's the best player developer. Uh, but special teams looks to be good. Both specialists return who were good for them last season. And overall, this is the best roster in the ACC. So now, moving on to the predictions. They start the year on the road at Florida. I think this will be a close one. Miami is a much better team than Florida, in my opinion, but I do think Florida has a good chance to pull the upset. And I do, though, think that Miami is so much better offensively than Florida is, and they are much better in the front seven to where they do win this game. Uh, but even if Miami loses this game to Florida, if you're a Miami fan, don't give up hope on having a good season because I know that you would hate to lose this game. One, because Florida is a in-state opponent who Miami doesn't play much, and then two, they're just not a very good team. But if there's one thing that this coach at Florida has done right since he's been there, it's to get one win early in the year that they're not supposed to get. Like in 2022, Florida upset Utah in the opener, and then Utah went on to win 10 games in their conference and beating Southern Cal, who won 11 games twice that season. And Florida went on to have a losing season, so it made no sense at the end of the season. And then last year, Florida upset Tennessee in week 3, and then Tennessee went on to win 9 games, while Florida went on to miss a bowl game. So these kind of things can happen in college football. Uh, so then they play Florida A&M, which will be a real easy win, and then they have Ball State, another real easy win. And then on the road at South Florida. So South Florida may be good enough to keep this close for a half, but I think Miami will pull away in the second half and blow them out. So then Virginia Tech at home on a Friday. So I think this will be a close one. I think Virginia Tech has a decent chance to pull this upset. So Virginia Tech, even though they're nowhere near as talented as Miami is, they're the most experienced team in college football this season. And Miami's coaching has not been great, but I think Miami's able to get it done. Then they play on the road at California. So I know this will be a travel to the whole other opposite side of the country for Miami. But other than that, there's no real hard thing about playing California for them. They have so much more talent than California does. California's an awful team, and I think they'll beat them easily. So then they play on the road at Louisville. They're not beating Louisville on the road. So I would be very surprised if Miami went on the road and won this game because Louisville, even though their coach doesn't recruit as well as Miami's coach does, they also loaded up with good players in the transfer portal this year. And they're a team that won 10 games last season. Miami, only won 7 games. And their coach at Louisville is like a million times better of a game time coach than Miami's is. So then they play Florida State in the big rivalry game at home. So I think this is a good matchup for Miami. Florida State's offense, I think, is going to be one dimensional this year. They're going to want to run the football a whole lot more than they're going to want to throw it. And Miami's front seven, I think, can slow that down some. And even though Miami has a weakness probably at the safety position, Florida State's not the type of team this year that's going to be able to take advantage of that. And Florida State's defense is still good, and I think they'll slow down Miami's offense. But I still think that Miami's offense is going to be good enough to where they can still make enough plays to win a really close one. So then they play uh, Duke. This should be an easy win. I don't think Duke's going to be any good this year. Should be a blowout. And then on the road at Georgia Tech. So I can't fully trust Mario Cristobal to win every game this year that he's supposed to win because he's cost his team so many games like this in the past. I still think he's going to lose one game this year that he's supposed to win, and I think this is it. So Miami is much better than Georgia Tech, and they should beat Georgia Tech. But Georgia Tech is a team that I think is going to be decent and will probably beat a few teams in the ACC that they're not supposed to beat this year. So Georgia Tech has a really good offensive line, and they're going to have a really strong run game, and they have a decent quarterback. And they've got a good secondary. So I do think this will be really close, though. And it's for sure a winnable game for Miami. I would not be surprised at all if Miami won this game. Then Wake Forest, this will be an easy win. They'll beat Wake no problem. Uh, and then on the road at Syracuse, another team like Georgia Tech that I think could possibly beat a team or two they're not supposed to this year. Syracuse brings in a lot of really good players from the transfer portal, and they also have a whole lot of production coming back. But I still think Miami's a little too good for Syracuse to win this. I think it'll be close though. And really, I think Miami's going to lose either the Georgia Tech game or the Syracuse game. I picked them to lose the Georgia Tech game because I still think Georgia Tech is a little bit better than Syracuse. But I wouldn't be surprised if Syracuse won this game. So my final prediction for Miami is 10-2 overall and 6-2 in the conference. And this might or might not put them in the ACC championship game, and probably a 50-50 chance of making the college football playoff if this is their record, if they don't win the ACC, because the ACC, is a horrible conference. But that will be it with this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe, and I'll be back soon.